Hello, and welcome to another prototype brought to you by the wonderful me. This time I'll be going over the Plight of Hubris. So, as per usual, we start out with a player movement, just blocking out the scene, and adding some basic inputs. Then I moved on to adding some player abilities, and integrating a health and mana system into said abilities. After ironing out the basics with the input, I started on the player animation using a sprite sheet I edited. Additionally, I also added some very basic animation to the player's abilities. Now here we're starting with our first AI, the melee underling. Setting up some basic animations for him and setting his patrol parameters. And now I moved on to the ranged underling. This one was a bit easier, as for the most part with respect to animations and movement it was a copy-paste job. But I wanted him to be able to run away when the player got too close and only attack from a given range. After I got everything working with the player and the two underlings, I started blocking out each scene with a sprite sheet and started populating it with the AI I had already made. This was pretty straightforward as I'd produced the level maps prior to this. Then I started adding the doors. These were the transition points between the stages that the player would have to destroy to access the trigger that took them to the next scene. After that I started working on the tutorials. These were text prompts that would tell the player the controls at given points in each stage, teaching them important mechanics that they needed to progress through the level. After that I added mana regeneration. I had the basic expending of mana when the player casts an ability. All I needed to do was to add the regeneration on the timer. Next is a bit of tweaking for the underlings, just fixing some of their detection. After that I started adding the basics of the boss, so giving him animations and setting up some functions for his attacks. I wanted to clearly structure this to make my life a bit easier when I was setting up the scene for the boss fight and transitioning between the different phases. Next I started setting up the cutscene that plays beforehand, in which the player is momentarily baited into the fight with the orc. Once the cutscene was finished, I started working on the phases individually. These were unrefined at first. I simply wanted to get the transitions working and the attacks working on a basic level first before polishing it up a bit later on. After that, I added the boss's death animations, so this would play as a similar cutscene to the beginning of the fight. Next we have some audio. I wanted to add a mixer in this time, as I wanted multiple types of audio playing in the scene. So we have background music, some 3D ambience from the fire and some of the projectiles, and the sound effects played by the player and enemies. After I'd finished setting up the audio, I started on the more refined HUD, so I wanted to replace the basic bars I had at the top left with something that looked a bit more sophisticated and fitted with the fancy theme a bit more. And here we have a bit more fidgeting with the sound effects specifically, as I had gotten the ambience working. After that I added the death screen and the win screen, which would be triggered on either the player dying or the boss being defeated. With respect to feedback, I got some lovely feedback From what I got, I wanted to add a couple of things. I wanted to smoothen out the transitions. I wanted to optimize the player experience for the boss fight as well. I did this a couple of ways. I increased the difficulty by increasing the speed of projectiles and giving the phase 3 projectile a homing. And as you saw, I also smoothed out the panning of the camera at the start of the boss fight. I also added some visual feedback to all of the aspects of the game that didn't already have them, such as all of the player's abilities and both visual and audio feedback for the double jump. And additionally some visual effects for projectiles from the boss, such as explosions. As per request of Costas as well, I also added some animation to the boss to indicate when he's been hit, giving him an additional sound effect and making him flash white when he is hit by a projectile. And after some bug fixes, I added in the boss's health bar to give the player an indication of their progression throughout the level, followed by some additional major UI screens such as the pause menu and better transitions between each UI with fading to black or white. Finally, I added the main menu with a play button and a quit button, and I made sure it looped between the boss fight and the start scene. And now I present to you some actual gameplay. I'm going to do one full run through of completing the level with no hitches, trying to show off every mechanic that I've both added and that have remained from the start. I'm also going to play the death scene at the end of this video. So now you can sit back, relax, and enjoy.